Denzel Washington? He's not an actor. He's a full-time martyr with a SAG card. That's what they said, mocking the man who turned pain into poetry, grief into gold. But tonight there's no script, no character to hide in. Just a man, live on national television, facing the silence he's carried for 40 years. This isn't a performance, it's a reckoning. And when the lights come on, the past walks in with them. It begins like this. The studio lights dimmed as the signature infernal theme of Truth Furnace rumbled through the air like the low growl of a predator about to pounce. Every camera was armed, every angle carefully calculated, every breath in the room held hostage by anticipation. This wasn't just a talk show, it was a coliseum of ideology, a ritual of modern-day bloodletting where ideas clashed harder than fists ever could. And tonight, the fire promised to burn brighter than ever. At center stage, the famed Blackstone table gleamed under the spotlight, its surface deliberately cold and brutalist. Two chairs faced each other across it, stiff, unwelcoming, meant not for comfort, but confrontation. On the left, Denzel Washington entered to a quiet storm of respectful applause. He moved like a man who had carried both glory and grief in his bones. There was gravity in his every step, the kind that didn't demand attention, but drew it in like a tide. Clad in a charcoal suit, crisp but unpretentious, Denzel's presence radiated calm intensity. He nodded once to the crowd, once to the host, and finally to the empty chair across from him. Then with a subtle breath, he sat, upright, ready, but not clenched. His hands rested open on the table, fingers gently laced. Then came the echo of polished shoes, sharp, unyielding. Kash Patel stepped in, the tailored edge of his navy blue suit slicing through the tension like a knife. No smile, no wave. Only a single nod, to the host, to the audience, and lastly, a direct, calculating look at Denzel. Cold, controlled, almost surgical. The two men shook hands over the table, briefly, firmly, without warmth. The host, a silver-tongued provocateur named Marla Vex, offered her opening monologue like a spell. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Truth Furnace. Tonight we bring you a conversation long overdue. Emotion versus logic, heart versus mind, story versus strategy. In one corner we have Mr. Denzel Washington, whose performances have made us cry, rage, reflect. In the other, Mr. Kash Patel, whose voice cuts through political noise like a scalpel. Precise, unapologetic, and some might say, ruthless. Let the furnace begin. The lights flared, the music died, and the silence that followed was volcanic. Denzel was the first to speak. His voice was warm velvet, honed through decades of both stage and street wisdom. We are living, he began, in a fractured society, not because people disagree, but because we've forgotten how to feel for one another. Somewhere along the road, empathy became weakness, and the world, our world, is bleeding because of it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word felt carved from something deeper, something earned. Across from him, Kash tilted his head with that almost imperceptible smirk that often preceded his deadliest lines. He let the silence linger, just a moment too long, then responded, his voice clipped and intellectual, like a professor dissecting a flawed thesis. No, Mr. Washington, the world isn't bleeding because we lack empathy. It's bleeding because we worship illusion, because we've replaced hard truths with cinematic sob stories. We tell ourselves that feeling is thinking, that pain equals moral authority. It doesn't. The room chilled. Denzel blinked once, slow. So you think the stories I tell, the pain I show, are illusions? I think, Kash replied, leaning forward just slightly, that too many people confuse performance with principle. And sometimes, Mr. Washington, your industry teaches people to cry about problems instead of fixing them. Denzel's smile was thin, tired, but something in his eyes began to sharpen. Less actor, more man. Let me ask you something, Kash. When was the last time you cried for someone else? Not for your politics, not for your strategy, but for another soul's hurt? Kash didn't flinch. Tears, he said evenly, are not policy. No, Denzel shot back. voice tightening like a drawn bowstring. But they're the beginning of humanity. The audience was frozen. No cheers, no applause. Just a breathless awareness that something bigger than debate was happening. This wasn't about left or right. It wasn't about data versus drama. It was about two men, two worldviews, colliding like tectonic plates beneath a fragile civilization. Cash's expression didn't crack, but something shifted in his tone. Quieter now. I've seen men cry on battlefields, in courtrooms, but emotion didn't stop the bullets. It didn't overturn the verdict. What matters, he said, is action, measurable, tactical, real. Denzel leaned forward, his voice now low, almost intimate. And what drives action, Cash? What drives sacrifice? You think Martin Luther King marched because he read spreadsheets? You think mothers fight for justice because they ran statistics through a model? For the first time, a flicker, just a flicker, of uncertainty passed through Cash's eyes. They fight, Denzel continued, because they feel. Because pain, when embraced, becomes purpose. And if you cut that out of the equation, you lose the very thing worth fighting for. Silence. Then Cash sat back, crossed his arms, and smiled. Tight, deliberate. Beautiful speech. Oscar-worthy. But this is real life, Denzel. And in real life, feelings get people killed. That line hit like a slap. Denzel's jaw tightened. And in real life, he said, voice like smoke and thunder, the absence of feeling is how monsters are born. The temperature dropped. Somewhere, someone in the audience whispered, "Damn!" Marla leaned in, whispering into her mic with relish. Ladies and gentlemen, the furnace has only just begun. And as the lights dimmed for the first commercial break, the camera lingered on Denzel and Cash. Two silhouettes, two souls, caught between fire and ice. The war of truths had started, and no one, least of all them, was walking out untouched. The cameras blinked back to life like sentinels watching over a battlefield moments before the charge. The room remained silent, not from calm but from voltage, static emotion that sizzled in the air. Denzel sat forward, elbows on the table now, his hands no longer laced but steepled, the way a preacher leans in before speaking the truth that burns. Cash adjusted his cufflink with surgical precision, eyes unblinking, posture coiled like a man who didn't come to play but to win. "You want numbers?" Denzel began, his voice steady but seething beneath the surface. "I'll give you stories, because sometimes the truth doesn't come in decimal points. It comes in broken voices, in folded flags, in empty chairs at kitchen tables." He turned slightly toward the camera, his eyes reflecting decades of pain he'd absorbed. Not just acted, but lived beside. "You know what it's like to knock on the door of a grieving mother in South Central LA, telling her that her baby was mistaken for a gang member?" "I do. Not because I had to, but because I chose to be there. Because no one else would." His voice dipped, darkened. "You know what it's like to see a 12-year-old boy watch his father bleed out in front of him because the ambulance took 35 minutes to arrive in the wrong part of town? I sat beside that boy. He never cried. You think emotion is weakness, Mr. Patel? Sometimes it's all we've got left." Cash didn't blink. He reached to the tablet before him, tapped twice, and the studio screen behind them flickered to life. Graphs, red and blue, arrows, timelines, bullet points, cold, precise, aggressive. He stood, his voice shifting into prosecutorial tempo. "Since 1990, violent crime in urban areas has dropped by 35%. Police accountability legislation has increased by 47% since 2008, and programs aimed at community healing have received over $1.2 billion in federal support. But despite all this, despite the data, what we get," he pointed to Denzel, "is a narrative that sells suffering, that romanticizes pain, that trades in perpetual victimhood as cultural currency." He stepped closer to the table. "Your stories stir emotions, yes. They win awards. They inspire hashtags. But what do they solve? What policies change? What behaviors shift? How many communities are actually healed?" Denzel stared at the graphs, then at Cash. "You talk about policies as if they float above people's lives. But people aren't bullet points. They're not data sets. They're real, bleeding, breathing. They're manipulated, Kash snapped, by elites who need them to stay broken so they can keep selling redemption stories. He turned again to the audience, his voice rising. You're not a healer, Denzel. You're a symptom of a society addicted to grievance. You are the poster child of a culture that rewards pain but punishes accountability. You are the result of a system that worships victimhood. The room erupted, not with applause, not with boos, but with that rare electric gasp that audiences make when someone crosses a line they didn't even know was there. The silence after was even louder. Denzel didn't speak right away. He stared at Kash, eyes unreadable, breath slow, 1 second, 2, 5. Then softly, he leaned in. You don't know, he said, what it feels like to be called worthless by the man who gave you your name. A hush fell over the room like ash. Denzel's voice cracked, but he kept going. You don't know what it's like to hear your own father tell you, you'll never be more than noise in the street. To carry that in your chest like a stone. To get on that stage, to speak those lines, to hold back tears because you keep hoping, just hoping, that maybe, just maybe, he's watching, and maybe this time he'll call. Maybe this time he'll say, I was wrong. He paused, and in that pause was the ache of decades. But the call never comes. Kash shifted in his seat, for once not speaking. Denzel exhaled, voice raw now, no performance left. So when I tell stories, when I pour my soul into those characters, it's not for Oscars. It's for the boy I used to be. It's for the men who were told they were nothing. It's for every black father and son who never made peace. I act because it's the only way I've ever had a voice. Kash opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came. Then, and what do you do when those stories keep men in chains instead of freeing them? When they become excuses instead of fuel? Denzel's reply was fire through clenched teeth. There's a difference between telling the truth and using it as a weapon. Maybe if you stopped slicing people open with your numbers, you'd see the wounds behind the statistics. Marla, the host, sat frozen, her hands hovering above her cue cards. She knew now, this wasn't just a segment. This was war. Kash straightened his posture. Feelings, he said slowly, are not facts. And facts, Denzel returned, without compassion, are just ammunition. The lights above flickered, not from power loss, but from something unspoken seizing the air. In that moment, it wasn't about who was right. It was about who still had the strength to keep going. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't move. They breathed in silence, hearts pounding with a question that neither man had yet answered. When truth becomes a weapon, who gets to wield it? The air had become heavier, as if gravity itself had sunk its claws into the room. Denzel's last words still echoed faintly in the minds of the audience, lingering like heat after lightning. Across the table, Kash remained composed, yet behind his eyes burned a calculation. Something was coming, something sharp. Marla's voice tried to pull the energy back toward diplomacy, but Kash raised a finger, silencing her with the confidence of a man holding an ace no one knew existed. I didn't come here, he said slowly, to argue about feelings. I came here to reveal something the world deserves to know. He reached down, pulled a small device from his inner jacket pocket. Sleek, black, cold. He placed it on the table with deliberate finality, like a weapon laid bare. Then with a single tap, the studio screen behind them came to life again. But this time, there were no graphs, no charts, just audio, crackling, old. Then a voice, gravelly, a little tired, unmistakably male, unmistakably familiar. And he was always dramatic, even as a kid, but not in a good way, not in a way that meant something. You know, I used to think maybe he'd grow out of it, but he didn't. He just stayed the same, sensitive, needy. And somewhere along the way, he started believing that being emotional made him righteous. It didn't. It just made him a disappointment. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Even the crew froze. The host turned white. Denzel didn't move, not at first. Then his hand twitched, fingers curling into a slow, dangerous fist on the table. His breathing sharpened, though he tried to hide it. His eyes, those legendary eyes that had stared down crooked cops, traitorous soldiers, and the devil himself on screen, flared wide with something raw. Not fury, not shock, betrayal. He turned slowly, gaze locked on Kash like a blade. "Where the hell did you get that?" Kash didn't blink. "From a recorded interview your father did in 1997. It was never aired. The studio thought it was too off-brand. Buried in a vault until I filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act. And before you ask, yes, it's authentic. Verified twice." Denzel's jaw clenched so tightly, his temple pulsed. His voice, when it came, was deeper than before, a low quake beneath the surface. "You did this. For what? Ratings?" Kash folded his hands calmly. "I did this because the world deserves to know the real you. Not the myth, not the martyr, the man, the boy who's still chasing the approval of a ghost." Silence dropped like a curtain. Denzel's breath hitched in his throat. The audience saw it. Millions saw it. The hesitation, the inward collapse. He looked down at the table as if searching for something. Anchor, shield, air. None came. "Do you think you're noble?" Denzel asked, quieter now. "Digging up pain like this, in front of strangers?" "I think truth," Kash said coldly, "doesn't owe you comfort or privacy. You built your image on personal pain. I'm just giving people the part you edited out." Marla tried to cut in, "Maybe we should take a moment." But no one listened. The furnace had consumed the stage, and its flame was Denzel's trembling silence. The camera zoomed in, tight on his face, sweat above the brow, a twitch at the corner of the eye. His hand, still clenched, now trembled slightly. His lips parted, words forming, failing, reforming again. "You don't know," he finally whispered, barely audible. Kash raised an eyebrow. "Say it louder." "You don't know what it's like." Denzel looked up, his voice rising with the storm brewing inside. "To grow up with a father who'd rather pray than hug, who would preach forgiveness to strangers, and then come home to remind his own son that he was soft, that he was small." Each word now came like a punch. "You think that recording humiliates me? Number, it proves me. Because I didn't become great because of him. I became great despite him." Kash leaned back, but didn't smile. He was watching now, observing the break. Denzel stood. For the first time tonight, he rose from his chair slowly, with a weight that could only come from years of carrying invisible scars. The studio crew scrambled to adjust cameras as he paced around the table. Not storming, but unraveling. That voice you just played, that's the voice I heard in my head every time I stepped on stage. Every time I thought about quitting. Every damn time someone said I wasn't enough. He turned to Kash. And still, I rose. Kash watched him. "But you never healed." "No," Denzel said, voice cracking now, "because there was nothing to heal with. He left. He disappeared. I didn't get closure. I got silence. And you think dragging his voice into this place helps anyone? It doesn't. It just reminds me that some wounds don't scar. They stay open." And in that moment, the audience, once hungry for spectacle, saw something else. Not an actor, not a politician, just a son, standing in a fire he didn't light. The light above the stage flickered again. The silence this time wasn't stunned. It was reverent, sacred. Kash broke it first, his voice low. "Sometimes, Denzel, the truth isn't here to hurt you. It's here to make you finally face what's already killing you." The camera cut to Denzel's face, eyes wet but unbroken. And then he sat back down. The battle hadn't ended, but the mask had been ripped clean off. He stood slowly, but it felt like an explosion. No slamming of fists, no outburst of fury, just the quiet devastation of a man unraveling in real time. Denzel pushed back the chair with a motion too calm to be rehearsed, too heavy to be staged. His face was unreadable, yet his body spoke in volumes. The stiffness of his shoulders, the barely controlled tremble in his jaw. A silence swept across the studio like a passing funeral procession. And before anyone could speak, Denzel walked off set. No goodbye, no parting line. Just the sound of his footsteps fading beneath the stunned hush of millions watching the feed live from their living rooms, phones, laptops, wherever truth now traveled. Marla blinked, frozen for the first time that night. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. We're going to take a brief intermission, she announced, her voice brittle around the edges. Please, stay tuned. But her words felt like ash, crumbling in the space Denzel had just vacated. The broadcast cut to commercial, but someone on the crew, perhaps out of instinct, or perhaps out of the very human thirst for unfiltered truth, kept one backstage camera rolling. And just like that, the world saw him again. Not Denzel Washington the icon, not the orator, not the character, but the man, sitting on a metal folding chair just beyond the curtain, elbows on knees, face in his hands, breathing shallow, erratic. The kind of breath you take after a punch that knocks the wind from your soul. His right hand twitched near his thigh, fingers curling, uncurling. His left hand gripped the edge of the chair as if it might fall away from under him. His eyes, once the anchors of 1,000 stories, now stared at the concrete floor like it might hold answers he'd never dared ask for. He wasn't crying, but he looked like a man who had run out of tears. Crew members scrambled around him, unsure whether to approach, whether to offer water or silence. One assistant began to move toward him, but a senior producer gently stopped her. "Give him a moment," they whispered. But the moment stretched, long and unbearable. The camera didn't cut, and somewhere, in homes across America, viewers began to lean forward, no longer watching a talk show, but witnessing a human being break. Back on set, Kash stood motionless. He had not spoken since Denzel's exit. The applause light was off. There was no need for it now. He walked slowly off stage and entered the green room. Inside, lit only by the soft reflection of dressing room bulbs, he stood before a mirror. And for the first time that night, he looked at himself. Not his tie, not his posture, himself. The Kash Patel staring back was not the one who walked onto the stage an hour ago. Confident, absolute, armored in truth. No, this Kash was different. A flicker had cracked through the glass and he saw it. He heard the echo of Denzel's words again. There was nothing to heal with, and in the silence of that mirror, something within him shifted. Not a collapse, not yet, but a tremor, a seed of doubt, because the truth, when wielded without mercy, had left something shattered in its wake. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had tapped play on the recording, and for a fleeting second, he didn't feel proud. He felt cold. Back on stage, Marla adjusted her earpiece. The control room was chaos, voices overlapping, producers barking into mics. Do we kill the feed? Do we pivot to archival footage? We've got nothing scheduled. We're flying blind. Keep the cameras rolling, but mute audio. Just hold steady. Wait for a signal. Then came the whisper. A young crew member, breathless, handed Marla a small folded slip of paper. She opened it. 4 words scribbled in firm, trembling handwriting. He wants to speak. She blinked, looked again. Then her eyes widened. He? She asked. The assistant nodded. Yes, he said. Him. Marla's breath caught. She turned slowly to the stage, adrenaline pulsing now. Not fear, not excitement, but something deeper. A sense that history was rewriting itself in real time. She stood, cleared her throat. Her voice steadied into its hosting cadence, but beneath it ran a current of awe. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a surprise request. A guest who has chosen, unexpectedly, to come forward and speak. Please stay with us. What you are about to witness was not scripted, was not planned, and may change everything. As the camera slowly panned toward the stage, the world held its breath. Backstage, Denzel remained seated, unaware of the note, of the motion set in place. His hands had steadied, his breathing calmer, but his eyes were still far away. And yet, something was approaching, a presence neither he nor Kash had anticipated, a truth neither of them had prepared for, a man neither of them had seen in decades. The furnace wasn't cooling, It was about to erupt. The studio lights softened, not by design but by some unspoken instinct, as if the room itself understood that what was about to unfold required reverence, not spectacle. The audience leaned forward, eyes wide, breath caught, as an unfamiliar figure stepped onto the stage. He moved slowly, deliberately, a thin man in an outdated, wrinkled gray suit. His gait was slightly uneven, as though each step came at the cost of a memory resurfaced. His frame was fragile, but his presence undeniable. The camera zoomed in gently, revealing a face lined with age, with regret. The kind of face that belonged to a man who had lived with silence as both companion and prison. His hands shook faintly at his sides, but he did not flinch from the lights, the crowd, or the storm he had willingly walked into. The man stopped at center stage and looked directly into the lens, not with performance, not with polish, but with raw, trembling truth. He began, and his voice was gravel wrapped in sorrow. I am the man who made him. A pause, but not in the way a father should. Murmurs rippled through the audience. A gasp here, a rustle there. Marla covered her mouth. Kash stiffened, unsure now if the battlefield had just been redrawn without him. Backstage, Denzel froze. The voice was unmistakable. Altered by time, raspier, slower. But buried in its cadence was the echo of childhood warnings, of sermons disguised as scoldings, of the man who left without saying goodbye. Denzel stood without thinking. His legs carried him forward before his mind caught up, before the fear could stop him. He passed the curtains, emerged into the light, and the moment he laid eyes on the figure in the center of the stage, the breath left his lungs. He stopped mid-step, eyes wide, disbelieving, as if someone had rewound time and skipped a chapter that was never meant to play. Dad, he said, the word barely audible. The man nodded, his own eyes glistening. Yes, son. A silence swept the studio so profound that the distant hum of stage lights became thunder. The old man didn't move. He didn't reach out. He only spoke, voice quivering. I watched the show tonight. I didn't come to speak. I didn't even come to be seen. But when I heard you say my name, not aloud, but between the pain in your words, I couldn't stay hidden. Not anymore. Denzel remained rooted, disbelief and rage wrestling in his chest like wild beasts. You left, he said. You disappeared. You said nothing. For decades, I know, the father replied, lowering his gaze. I was a coward. The audience didn't stir. The world behind the screen had gone still. The man's voice cracked now, breaking open. I told myself I was teaching you to be strong. I believed that hardness made men, that hugs made them weak. I thought by pushing you, by ignoring you, I'd drive you into greatness. But what I did, he looked up again, eyes hollow with shame, was wound a boy so deeply he had to become someone else just to survive. Denzel's lips parted, but no words came. His jaw clenched, his chest rose and fell with uneven rhythm. He blinked rapidly, as if each blink could erase what he was seeing. I watched you grow, his father continued, from afar. On screen, on stages, always becoming someone else, always trying to be enough. And I cheered in the dark. I clapped when no one could hear, but I never picked up the phone, not once. He took a step forward, because I was afraid that if I called, you'd ask me why I left, and I didn't have the courage to answer. Denzel's legs gave a half step. His eyes brimmed with something molten. The mask of poise, the armor of stardom. It all cracked, slowly, beautifully. Tonight, the old man said, I realized I was going to die soon, and I couldn't go without saying it. His voice broke completely now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every night you waited, every play you hoped I'd attend, every headline I ignored. I failed you, son, not once, not twice, but for a lifetime. Then with a breath that seemed to cost everything he had, he said, and I never stopped loving you. Not one day. The tears came then, not from the father, but from the son. For the first time in the history of his career, on live television, Denzel Washington cried. He didn't sob. He didn't wail. He simply stood there, silent as the tears slipped down his cheeks like they'd been waiting his entire life for permission to fall. And no one moved. Not the audience, not the host, not even Kash Patel, who now sat on the edge of his chair, lips pressed tight, a hand over his mouth as if to hold back something not yet formed. Denzel took a single shaking step forward, then another. His father opened his arms, tentatively, unsure, a gesture without expectation. But Denzel didn't hesitate. He stepped in, collapsed into them, and the two men, one broken by silence, the other by absence, stood beneath the blinding lights of truth, locked in a long, trembling embrace. No applause broke the moment. No camera dared cut away. Because some truths aren't spoken, they are held, and in that embrace the world saw something it rarely does. Redemption, not for ratings, but for the soul. He didn't realize he'd stopped breathing. Kash sat frozen, his hands limp in his lap, as the two men, father and son, clung to one another at center stage beneath the weight of years lost. The hug wasn't graceful, it was messy, trembling, imperfect, but it was real. And in that moment, something in Kash Patel, something carefully constructed over decades, began to crack. The studio had fallen into an unspoken reverence. No music, no direction, just silence, thick with meaning. Kash stared at them, but what he saw wasn't just Denzel or the old man in the tattered suit. What he saw was himself, years younger, smaller, colder, curled on the front porch of a suburban home in Northern Virginia. Knees to chest, hands wrapped around bare arms, breath fogging in the bitter December air. The porch light was off, the windows closed, the house silent. He was 8, maybe 9. His crime, crying after his dog was taken away. His father's voice, still etched into the walls of his skull, returned like ice. You want to cry? Then cry like a man, outside, until you learn to shut it off. The wind that night had howled. The frostbite had left his fingers numb. But he didn't go back in. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. That was the night Kash learned silence. That was the night he stopped being a child. And tonight, so many years, degrees, accolades later, he watched another man, a man the world revered for strength, collapse into his father's arms and weep. And he envied him. God, he envied him. Slowly, mechanically, Kash rose to his feet. His legs felt foreign beneath him. The set felt like a dream. He took one step, then another. Each movement felt like walking into fire, barefoot, into a place his mind had locked away. He didn't speak until he was halfway to the stage. Then quietly, "May I say something?" Denzel pulled slightly away from his father, eyes red but focused. He didn't nod. He didn't stop him either. Kash turned to the audience, then back to them, then finally faced the blinding stage lights as if offering himself to judgment. "My father," he said slowly, voice catching, "was a man of rules. Discipline, order, but no warmth, and certainly no tears." He glanced downward, searching the floor for steadiness. "I remember crying once when I was a kid. Just once. After my dog, Max, was taken to the shelter without warning. I cried like the world had ended. My father didn't say a word. Just opened the door, pointed outside." He looked up again. It was below freezing. I sat outside for 2 hours. When I came back in, he didn't look at me. He just said, "Now you know," and I did. He took a breath. From that night forward, I didn't cry again. Not when I lost friends in Afghanistan. Not when my mother passed, not even at her funeral. His jaw trembled, and for the first time in the public eye, his voice broke. But tonight, seeing you two, seeing a son forgive, and a father finally speak, I felt something crack. Something I didn't know was still inside me. He turned now to Denzel. "I attacked you with facts. I wielded truth like a scalpel. But what I didn't realize was that I was doing it not to reveal you, but to avoid confronting me." Denzel stood silent, listening. His father lowered his eyes as if honoring the pain in the man before them. Kash continued, now quieter. "I'm sorry. Not for debating you, not for disagreeing, but for dismissing the wounds I didn't take time to understand. I thought I was above emotion. I thought I had mastered logic. But I see now, I've just been hiding. He stepped closer, tears now threatening the corner of his eyes. I haven't cried in over 30 years, he said, voice trembling, until right now. And with that, his voice cracked fully. A single tear slid down his cheek, awkward, uncertain, as if unfamiliar with the trail. He didn't wipe it. He let it fall. The three men stood on stage. 3 generations, 3 shadows shaped by fathers in silence. Denzel, a sun-turned legend, whose strength had been mistaken for armor when it was really scar tissue. His father, bent and broken, but brave enough to kneel at the altar of accountability. And Kash, long thought impenetrable, now exposed, human, undone. The stage lights above cast long shadows behind them, merging, stretching, converging like some divine geometry. No one in the studio breathed. No one dared disturb the sanctity of what had just been unmade and then reborn. 3 men, 3 bruised hearts. One moment of truth that didn't shatter, it softened. And in that silence, the world finally listened. No music played, no triumphant swell, no cue to signal the audience's applause. Just silence, pure and uninterrupted. The kind of silence that demands to be felt, not filled. The kind that wraps around the soul and tells it, gently, that something sacred has just happened. The lights above the Truth Furnace stage dimmed ever so slightly, not to conclude the show, but to soften its edges, as though the story hadn't ended, only paused. Denzel stood between his father and Kash, shoulders relaxed for the first time all night. His eyes, still glistening, carried no anger, no shame, just release. The weight he had borne for decades, of expectation, of abandonment, of pride forged in pain, had been exhaled, and what remained was something simpler, quieter, human. He turned first to his father. The old man was trembling, not from weakness, but from the aftershock of truth spoken too late, yet somehow still heard. Denzel nodded once, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in recognition. A beginning, fragile and unspoken. Then Denzel turned to Kash, the man who had, only an hour earlier, been the embodiment of cold certainty, the one who wielded data like daggers and truth like artillery. But now, standing raw and unguarded, he looked less like an adversary and more like a mirror, flawed, fractured, but real. Denzel took a breath, deep, grounded. Then he said, steady and slow, "Thank you." Kash blinked. "For what?" "For forcing me," Denzel replied, "to look into the eyes of the demon I've been running from my whole life." He glanced at his father. "For making me face the silence I turned into armor, the silence I turned into applause." He looked back at Kash, voice thick with something heavier than gratitude, acknowledgement. "You didn't just challenge me. You cracked me open, and it hurt. But maybe that pain was the doorway." Kash opened his mouth, closed it. There were no words to follow that. Only a bowed head, a breath, and a hand, his hand, slowly reaching forward. Denzel looked at it, then took it. Their handshake was firm, not of agreement, not of alliance, but of mutual surrender to something bigger than ego. Marla, still on stage, stepped forward slowly. Her voice, usually so sharp and controlled, now came softer. She spoke to the camera, but her eyes never left the 3 men before her. "There are some confrontations," she said, "that aren't meant to crown a victor. They exist not to declare who's right or who's wrong, but to let broken hearts hear one another, if only for a beat longer."